In our last video, we created this ball and repositioned its origin point. In this video, we're going to get this ball bouncing. But before we do that, let's put in the environment graphics that we're going to need, the floor and the back wall. And we're going to do that very simply just by coming up here to our tool panel at the top, and I'm going to choose my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to roughly draw in a rectangle at the bottom of my stage to represent the floor. Now in the demo, I showed this as a gradient. So I'm going to quickly create a gradient here. I'm going to come back over to my color section of my properties panel. I'm going to click on my gradient swatch, and I'm going to create a radial gradient. Again, I'm going to reposition my color stop so that my light color is in the center. I'm also going to reduce the saturation and intensity of this color here. I'm just going to bring this out to something like that. I like that gradient. I'm going to save it by clicking on this little plus button there. Now I can use this gradient in the future. And in fact, I'm going to press the return button. I'm going to use it one more time. I'm going to draw out yet another rectangle. This will be my back wall, and I'm just going to click, drag that down like that. Come over to my gradient swatch and select the saved gradient that I have there. Now I do have these graphics sitting over top of my ball. As you can see, the ellipse here in my timeline panel is below the rectangles that I've just created. I mentioned this earlier that we can't reposition our layers here. We can reposition our layers or reorder our layers up here in the elements panel, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I've got the rectangle 2 selected. I'll shift select the other rectangle and drag those both below the ellipse, and now I have the ellipse in this environment. Well, I mean, that's okay. I mean, we could do something else with this. Perhaps I might change the back wall just a little bit. I find the light part of this back wall almost too light for this ball. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to click once on this color swatch, and I'm going to choose a slightly darker version of that color. Something like that. In fact, I'm going to save that gradient as well. So now here's my dark wall color, here's my light floor color. Okay, press return, and there I have my environment. Now at least I know where I want this ball to drop down to. But before we do that, I just want to remind you of our 3-step process in creating an animation. The first step is to create a keyframe for the property that we want to animate. Step 2 is to move along our timeline to the point at which we want that animation to stop happening. And step 3 is to change the value of the property that we originally had set. Well, first I have to determine what property I want to set a keyframe for. I want this to bounce straight down. This vertical axis is called our y-axis. So if I come over to my properties panel and see that in fact I do have a position and size section, and here is my y value for that position, and I'm just going to click on that keyframe right there. You can see now I have a keyframe along my timeline. The property that is being named here is called top. I do find that a little bit confusing because it should be Y, but in fact it says top. So that is step 1. I'm going to do step 2. I'm going to move along my timeline. I'm going to come out to the 1 second point along our timeline. You can see there it is in our time code, 1 second. And at this point, I'm going to change our value. The easiest way for me to do this is actually just to click on that ball and move it down while holding the shift button to constrain its Y position. There we have it. We now have, if I scrub this timeline, we can see that we now have a ball that is dropping. It doesn't look realistic yet. We will get to that. What I'm going to do next is I want this ball to bounce back up to its original position because I want this ball to be looping. Because I already have a keyframe here for this position, I just need to move along my timeline to the point where I want that animation to stop happening, which is in my case the 2 second point, and I need to move this back up to its original position. The easiest way to do that is actually just to copy the keyframe for this original position. If I just select that and come to the Edit drop-down menu and select Copy, or Command-C on my keyboard, I've now copied that keyframe or that value for this property. I can paste that keyframe where the current time indicator is currently situated. I go Command-V on my keyboard. Now you can see I have an animation that occurs where the ball starts, hits the ground, and bounces back up to its starting point, and there we go. And if we were to preview this in a browser, I could hit Command Return on my keyboard, or I could come to the File drop-down menu and select Preview in Browser. And you can see we have, well, gee, not much of an animation, but I mean, it's working generally, but let's make this look much better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here, and I want you to do a little thought experiment with me for a second. As we imagine this ball falling and hitting the ground, this ball I want you to imagine as being a rubber ball, so it's going to have a little bit of elasticity, what animators call squash and stretch. So if this ball hits the ground, we're going to see a little bit of expansion in its width and a little bit of compression in its height. So how are we going to do that? In order for that to occur, I want you to imagine this ball is going to actually have to be on the ground for a couple of frames at least. The way we've currently got this animated, it stays on the ground for exactly one frame and then immediately goes back into the air. What I want to do is I want there to be a little bit of a gap between these two animations where the ball is going to stay on the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select this second animation, this second transition strip where it starts to go up into the air, and I'm going to drag that out along my timeline just for a little bit. So there's a little bit of a gap in between these two transition strips. This is the time that the ball is going to be on the ground. Okay. So we've got that set up. What I want you to do now is think about what properties we need to change in order to get that squash and stretch effect that I was describing. If you look over in our properties panel, you can see that, hey, we have a transform section. Well, that's what we want to do. We want to transform it. And in fact, right underneath that, these two properties refer to our scale. We have a scale X property and a scale Y property. And we want to change both of those, don't we? But we don't want them to be linked together. We want to change those values separately. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unlink those two values. The next thing I'm going to do is, like I said, the very first step in our animation process, we need to create keyframes, right? So I'm going to set a keyframe here. Before we do that, make sure that your current time indicator is sitting at the beginning of the gap between these two animations. If it's in that position, then let's create two keyframes for that time and place, basically saying that as this ball falls, just as it hits the ground, it's still going to have its 100% scaling in its X and Y values. All right, now, what we're going to do is we are going to try to position our current time indicator right in between these two transition strips. But you'll notice that I'm zoomed in enough into my timeline that I can't actually reposition that. I can change this, however. Watch this. I'm going to come down to the very bottom right of our timeline panel, and I'm going to drag this little button over to the right. And you can see what that's doing is we're zooming into our timeline. And this is going to make it much easier for me to position this right in between there. Because imagine right in between the transition strip where the ball is falling and the ball is rising back up into the air is when we're going to have our maximum squash and stretch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the X scale value to about 120. I'm just going to click and drag that out to 120. Now you can see it's gotten quite fat. But we have to have an equal compression on the Y. So I'm going to reduce that down also to about roughly 80%. There we go. Now with this, you can see this ball is really pancaking out quite well. If I drag that, there we go. Now, after it's compressed to this point, it's going to regain its shape as it bounces back up into the air. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these two keyframes when it was at its full X and Y scale. And I'm going to hit Command-C, move my timeline over to where I want this ball to again regain its shape, and I'm going to paste those keyframes back. If I scrub the timeline, you can see now I have that squash and stretch effect that I was looking for as this ball hits the ground and then starts to compress back up into the air. Now let's see what that looks like. I'm going to come to my File drop-down and click Preview in Browser or Command Return. Wow, there we go. So we have a single bounce where that ball hits the ground, compresses just a little bit, and then bounces back up. In our next video, we are going to add what's called easing to our animation to give this ball a bit more of a realistic bounce look.